127 degrees. In the shade. Not in the Sahara, not in the Rub al Khali, not in Death Valley during a record-breaking summer that gets its own documentary. In Phoenix, Arizona, in a neighborhood where people have lived for decades, where the streets have names and the houses have air conditioners and the grocery stores are 12 minutes away. 127 degrees in the shade on a Wednesday afternoon in a city of 5 million people who woke up that morning and went about their lives the way people do when the temperature is something they have always believed they can manage. They were wrong, and the thing that made them wrong was not an ordinary heat wave. It was not the kind of heat that meteorologists describe as extreme, and that residents of the American Southwest have learned to endure through long experience and cultural adaptation, and the particular stoicism that comes from living in a desert city where summer is not a season, but a test. What was building over the American Southwest in the final weeks of that summer was something that the instruments measuring it had never measured before in that location, something that the models predicting it had underestimated by margins that made the forecasters reviewing their own output pause and check their calculations a second time. What was building was a heat dome, and this one was different from the heat domes that had come before it in ways that the atmospheric scientists monitoring it were only beginning to fully characterize when the temperatures started breaking records that had seemed permanent. The term heat dome entered the public vocabulary in June of 2021, when a blocking high-pressure system settled over the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, and produced temperatures that were not supposed to be physically possible in Seattle and Portland and Vancouver. Lytton, British Columbia reached 49.6 degrees Celsius, a temperature that broke the Canadian national temperature record by almost 5 degrees in a single event, and that was followed the next day by a wildfire that destroyed the town. Nearly 600 people died in British Columbia alone during that event, most of them elderly, most of them in homes without air conditioning, in a region where air conditioning had never been considered necessary because the climate had never required it. The heat dome of 2021 was a scientific landmark and a human catastrophe simultaneously. It was the event that forced the atmospheric science community to reckon with the possibility that the climate system was capable of producing temperature extremes that fell outside the envelope of what historical data suggested was possible. The heat dome now building over the American Southwest was not the same event. It was occurring in a different region, in a different season, under a different set of atmospheric conditions. But it shared with the 2021 event the characteristic that made both of them scientifically remarkable and humanly alarming. It was exceeding the upper bounds of what the models had suggested was possible for its location and time of year. Not barely exceeding, not nudging past the previous record by a fraction of a degree, the way normal record-breaking temperatures typically occur, exceeding by margins that required the meteorologists reporting them to double-check their instruments, to verify the data quality, to confirm that the readings were real and not artifacts of sensor malfunction or calibration error. The readings were real, the heat dome was real, and the 127 degrees in the shade that the Phoenix residents stepping out of their air-conditioned house felt on their skin for the 3 seconds it took to get to their car was a temperature that the human body was not designed to survive for any meaningful duration. The physics of how a heat dome forms is straightforward enough to explain in a paragraph, but complex enough in its details to have occupied the careers of atmospheric dynamicists for decades. A heat dome is created when a ridge of high pressure in the upper atmosphere, the kind of pressure ridge that is associated with sinking air and clear skies and suppressed cloud formation, becomes unusually strong and unusually persistent. In the upper atmosphere, roughly 5 to 9 miles above the surface, the air moves in large-scale wave patterns that circle the globe from west to east, steered by the jet stream. When those wave patterns become amplified, when the ridges of high pressure and the troughs of low pressure that define the wave pattern become more extreme in their north-south extent, the ridges can build to amplitudes that block the normal eastward progression of weather systems. A blocking ridge that would normally move east over the course of days instead stalls. The air above it continues to sink. Sinking air compresses and warms. The warming suppresses cloud formation because the warm sinking air inhibits the upward convection that produces clouds. Without clouds, the sun reaches the surface unimpeded. The surface heats. The hot surface heats the air above it. The The warm air rises slightly but is capped by the sinking air of the blocking ridge above. The heat accumulates. Day after day, the cycle repeats, with each day beginning slightly hotter than the last because the surface has not cooled adequately overnight to reset the baseline. The dome of hot air grows deeper and hotter until the blocking pattern eventually breaks down and the trapped heat disperses. The duration of a heat dome is the critical variable. A heat dome that lasts 3 days is dangerous. A heat dome that lasts 10 days is potentially catastrophic in any populated region with significant numbers of people who lack access to cooling. A heat dome that lasts 3 weeks, as the one now building over the American Southwest appeared from the model guidance to be tracking toward, is something that enters a different category entirely. 3 weeks of temperatures above 115 degrees Fahrenheit in Phoenix is not 3 times as dangerous as 1 week of those temperatures. It is exponentially more dangerous because the human body's ability to cope with extreme heat is cumulative in its degradation. A person who has endured 8 days of temperatures above 115 degrees is significantly more physiologically compromised than a person experiencing day 1 of the same conditions, even if they have had adequate water and cooling access throughout. The body's thermoregulatory capacity is not infinite. It degrades. And in a city the size of Phoenix, with a population that includes hundreds of thousands of elderly residents, hundreds of thousands of outdoor workers, tens of thousands of people experiencing homelessness without reliable access to cooling, and a significant fraction of the general population whose air conditioning systems are old, underpowered, or dependent on an electrical grid that is itself under extraordinary stress from the aggregate demand of 5 million people, all running their air conditioning simultaneously, the degradation of that thermoregulatory capacity across a population over weeks is a public health emergency of a scale that the city's systems were not fully designed to manage. The electrical grid is the invisible infrastructure on which everything else depends during an extreme heat event. Air conditioning is not an amenity in Phoenix in July, it is a life support system. The distinction is not rhetorical. At 127 degrees in the shade, the human body begins losing the ability to cool itself through sweating within minutes of sun exposure. Core body temperature begins to rise. Without intervention, hypothermia progresses to heat stroke within a time frame that depends on the individual's age, health status, hydration level, and physical activity. But that for a vulnerable individual in full sun at those temperatures can be measured in tens of minutes rather than hours. The air conditioning that keeps that progression from occurring requires electricity. The electricity comes from a grid that is being asked to deliver more power simultaneously than it has ever been asked to deliver in its operating history. Because every air conditioner in a 5 million person city is running at maximum capacity at the same time, on a day when the temperature is 127 degrees in the shade. The peak demand on the Arizona electrical grid during the heat dome event broke the previous peak demand record by a margin that the grid operators had not anticipated in their planning scenarios. Grid operators plan for peak demand based on historical patterns and forward projections that incorporate population growth and expected efficiency improvements in the building stock. The forward projections did not incorporate a heat event of this magnitude because a heat event of this magnitude had not occurred before in the historical record on which the projections were based. The grid was capable of meeting demand under the scenarios it had been planned for. It was not capable of meeting demand under the scenario that was actually occurring. The gap between those two statements represents the margin by which the heat dome exceeded the planning envelope. And it was in that gap, in the hours when the grid was operating at the edge of its capacity, where rotating outages were being managed to prevent total grid failure, where the air conditioning systems in neighbourhoods without reliable power were cycling off and on under load management protocols, where the most vulnerable residents of the city were losing the one system on which their survival depended, that the heat dome stopped being a meteorological event and became a humanitarian crisis. The vulnerability distribution within Phoenix during the heat dome event was not uniform, and understanding why it was not uniform requires understanding something about how the city was built and how that built environment interacts with extreme heat in ways that are now being studied with an urgency that was not present before temperatures started breaking records that had seemed permanent. Phoenix was built during an era of cheap energy and cheap land, and a cultural assumption that the desert climate was a manageable inconvenience rather than a fundamental constraint on how cities could be designed. The result was a city of extraordinary horizontal sprawl, of low-density single-family housing spreading across a desert landscape with minimal tree cover and maximum impervious surface, of parking lots and roads and rooftops that absorb solar radiation throughout the day and release it as heat through the night, preventing the nocturnal cooling that is essential for the human body to recover from daytime heat exposure. The urban heat island effect in Phoenix is among the most extreme of any city on Earth. The urban heat island is the phenomenon by which cities are significantly warmer than the surrounding rural landscape, driven by the heat-absorbing properties of urban surfaces, the waste heat generated by human activities, and the reduced evaporative cooling that results from replacing vegetation with pavement and buildings. In most cities, the urban heat island effect adds a few degrees to the urban temperature relative to the rural surroundings. In Phoenix, the effect has been measured at magnitudes that dwarf the typical urban heat island, partly because the surrounding landscape is already desert, with minimal evaporative cooling, and partly because the specific way Phoenix was built maximizes the heat-absorbing and heat-retaining properties of the urban surface. Neighborhoods in Phoenix can differ in their nighttime temperatures by as much as 10 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on their tree cover, their proximity to parks and open space, and the age and composition of their building stock. The neighborhoods with the least tree cover and the oldest building stock are the neighborhoods where the nighttime temperatures are highest, where the body's overnight recovery from daytime heat stress is most compromised, and where the residents are most likely to be elderly, lower income, and without reliable air conditioning. The spatial distribution of heat vulnerability in Phoenix maps almost perfectly onto the spatial distribution of economic and racial segregation in Phoenix, a correspondence that is not coincidental and that reflects decades of land use decisions, investment patterns, and policy choices that concentrated heat-vulnerable populations in heat-vulnerable neighborhoods. The neighborhoods that were redlined in the mid-20th century, that received less investment in parks and tree planting and infrastructure maintenance, that were built with cheaper construction materials that hold heat more effectively, are the neighborhoods where the urban heat island effect is most extreme, and where the residents have the fewest resources to adapt to that extreme. A resident of one of Phoenix's wealthier northern suburbs during the heat dome event was experiencing temperatures that were genuinely dangerous, but that their well-insulated, recently constructed home with a high-efficiency air conditioning system and adequate electrical service could manage. A resident of a lower-income neighborhood in the older parts of the city was experiencing temperatures that were several degrees higher in a home that was less well-insulated with an older and less efficient air conditioning system served by electrical infrastructure that was more susceptible to the load management protocols that cycled power off during peak demand periods, and with fewer financial resources to pay for the electricity bill that running air conditioning at maximum capacity for 3 weeks would generate. The electricity bill dimension of heat vulnerability is one that public health researchers have been studying with increasing intensity as extreme heat events have become more frequent and more severe. The cost of running air conditioning during an extreme heat event is not trivial. For a low-income household in Phoenix with an older, less efficient air conditioning system running continuously for 3 weeks during a heat dome, the electricity bill can reach multiples of the household's normal monthly expenditure. Families facing that kind of bill face a choice between paying for cooling and paying for food, rent, or medication. Some of them make the economically rational but physiologically dangerous choice to reduce their cooling usage to reduce their bill. Some of them have their power cut off for non-payment during the event, or arrive at the heat dome with service already disconnected for a previous non-payment. The intersection of heat vulnerability and energy poverty is one of the most consistently deadly features of extreme heat events in American cities, and one of the most consistently underfunded areas of public health preparedness. The wet bulb temperature is the measurement that atmospheric scientists use to characterize the combined effect of temperature and humidity on the human body's ability to cool itself through sweating. Sweating is the primary mechanism by which the human body maintains its core temperature in hot conditions. The efficiency of sweating as a cooling mechanism depends on the humidity of the surrounding air. In dry air, sweat evaporates quickly, removing heat from the body efficiently. In humid air, evaporation is slower, and the cooling effect of sweating is diminished. The wet bulb temperature combines temperature and humidity into a single metric that directly reflects the physiological cooling load on the human body. A wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, approximately 95 degrees Fahrenheit, represents the theoretical upper limit of what a healthy adult can survive with prolonged exposure. Because above that wet bulb temperature, the human body cannot dissipate heat faster than it generates it, even through maximum sweating. The body's core temperature rises inexorably. Heat stroke follows. Death follows. The heat dome building over the American Southwest was producing wet bulb temperatures that were approaching this theoretical survival limit in some locations. Not because the relative humidity was high in the desert Southwest, where it is typically low, but because the absolute temperature was so extreme that even the low relative humidity of the desert produced wet bulb temperatures in ranges that had previously been considered academic rather than operational concerns. When the temperature is 127 degrees Fahrenheit and the relative humidity is 15%, the wet bulb temperature is approximately 88 degrees Fahrenheit, well below the theoretical survival limit for a healthy adult. But 88 degrees Fahrenheit wet bulb in a desert environment is not survivable for extended periods by elderly individuals, by people with cardiovascular or respiratory disease, by infants, or by outdoor workers performing physical labor. The margin between the wet bulb temperatures being experienced during the heat dome and the wet bulb temperatures at which even healthy adults begin to experience life-threatening heat stress was narrower than it had ever been in recorded observations for that region. The outdoor workers are the population whose heat exposure during an extreme heat event is qualitatively different from the heat exposure of people who have access to air-conditioned indoor spaces during the hottest parts of the day. Construction workers, agricultural workers, landscapers, delivery drivers, road maintenance crews, utility workers maintaining the electrical infrastructure that keeps everyone else's air conditioning running. These workers do not have the option of retreating to an air-conditioned environment when the temperature climbs above 100 degrees. They are working in that temperature, performing physical labor that generates additional body heat on top of the ambient heat load, drinking water at rates that their bodies require, but that are difficult to maintain access to in a field, or on a construction site, or on a delivery route covering dozens of stops across a city where the temperatures in direct sun are significantly higher than the temperatures in the shade. The regulatory framework governing occupational heat exposure in the United States is a patchwork of state and federal standards that, prior to the heat dome events of the early 2020s, had not been updated in decades to reflect the new temperature realities that climate change was producing. Federal OSHA standards for heat exposure existed in the form of General Duty Clause requirements and guidance documents, but not as specific enforceable standards with defined temperature thresholds for required breaks, mandatory water provision, and heat illness response protocols. Several states had adopted their own heat protection standards for outdoor workers, but the states with the largest outdoor agricultural workforces, the states where field workers were spending the most hours in the most extreme conditions, were among the states without comprehensive heat protection regulations. The political economy of agricultural labour regulation in those states made the adoption of stronger standards difficult, and the workers most exposed to the heat, many of them undocumented immigrants with limited access to legal protections and limited ability to advocate for their own safety without risking their employment, were the workers least positioned to demand the regulatory protections they needed. The heat mortality statistics from extreme heat events in the United States are systematically undercounted, and the undercount is largest for the populations most vulnerable to heat. The official cause of death assigned to someone who dies of a heart attack, or a stroke, or respiratory failure during a heatwave is typically listed as the proximate cause, the cardiovascular or respiratory condition, rather than the heat that triggered or accelerated the fatal episode. The attribution of a death to heat requires either a specific finding of hypothermia, an elevated body temperature measured at the time of death or shortly before, or an epidemiological assessment that compares the number of deaths during the heat event to the expected number of deaths based on historical patterns, and identifies the excess mortality attributable to the heat. The first method undercounts, because many heat-related deaths occur in settings where body temperature is not measured before cooling occurs, and because the physiological mechanisms by which heat kills are often mediated through other organ system failures that are more easily coded as the cause of death. The second method requires data analysis after the fact and produces estimates that are available weeks to months after the event, too late to inform the immediate emergency response and too late to be connected in public awareness to the heat event that caused them. Researchers who have applied excess mortality analysis to historical heat events in American cities have consistently found that the officially recorded heat deaths represent a fraction of the actual mortality attributable to the heat, with ratios of actual to recorded deaths ranging from 2:1 to 10:1 or higher, depending on the event and the methodology. The heat dome of 2021 in the Pacific Northwest was officially attributed to approximately 800 deaths in the United States and Canada combined. Excess mortality analyses conducted in the months after the event suggested the actual mortality burden was several times higher. The heat dome now building over the American Southwest was going to produce mortality that would take months of epidemiological analysis to fully characterize, and the official death toll that would be reported in real time during the event would be a significant underestimate of the actual human cost. The animals and ecosystems of the Sonoran Desert, which surrounds Phoenix and extends across much of southern Arizona and into northern Mexico, were experiencing the heat dome alongside the human population above them, and in ways that were generating scientific observations that were unprecedented in the ecological literature of the region. The Sonoran Desert is one of the most biologically diverse desert ecosystems on Earth, home to the iconic saguaro cactus that is the defining image of the American Southwest, and to hundreds of species of plants, birds, reptiles, mammals, and insects that have evolved over millions of years to survive in an environment of extreme heat and limited water. The adaptation strategies of Sonoran Desert organisms to heat are among the most sophisticated in the biological world. But those adaptations were evolved for the range of temperatures that had characterized the Sonoran Desert over the millions of years of the species' evolutionary history. They were not evolved for temperatures that exceeded that historical range by the margins being produced by the heat dome. The saguaro cactus is a particularly important indicator species for the health of the Sonoran Desert ecosystem and for the trajectory of climate change impacts in the region. The saguaro can live for 150 years or more and can reach heights of 12 meters. It stores hundreds of liters of water in its accordion-pleated trunk and arms, using that stored water to survive the dry periods between monsoon rains. It is one of the most physiologically sophisticated drought tolerance mechanisms in the plant kingdom. But the saguaro has thermal limits as well as water limits. The tissue of the cactus can withstand high temperatures, but not unlimited temperatures, and the combination of extreme heat and the water stress that prolonged heat produces can overwhelm even the saguaro's remarkable physiology. During heat dome events in the preceding years, researchers monitoring saguaro populations across the Sonoran Desert had documented increasing rates of tissue damage, of sun scald on the south-facing surfaces of the cactus arms, of mortality among younger plants that had not yet developed the full water storage capacity of mature individuals. The current heat dome was producing temperatures that were pushing the thermal tolerance of even mature saguaros in the most exposed locations. The birds of the Sonoran Desert were responding to the heat dome in ways that ornithologists monitoring the region were documenting with a combination of scientific interest and personal alarm. Desert birds have evolved behavioral thermoregulation strategies that allow them to survive high temperatures, seeking shade during the hottest hours, reducing activity to minimize metabolic heat generation, panting to promote evaporative cooling from the respiratory tract, orientating their bodies to minimize the surface area exposed to direct solar radiation. These strategies work within the temperature range to which the species are adapted. At temperatures significantly above that range, the strategies reach their limits. Birds found dead or dying in unusual locations, in open ground rather than in the shade where they would normally seek refuge, unable to maintain the body position and behavioral state required for thermoregulation, were being reported by observers across the region. The species affected included birds that had been residents of the Sonoran Desert for thousands of generations, and whose thermal tolerance was considered well characterized by the scientific literature. The heat dome was testing the upper bounds of that tolerance in ways that the literature had not anticipated. The monsoon system that normally provides the Sonoran Desert with its summer rainfall and that provides some relief from the extreme early summer heat was tracking behind its historical average timing for the year. The North American monsoon, which typically establishes across the desert southwest in early to mid-July, bringing moisture from the Gulf of California and the Gulf of Mexico, and producing the afternoon thunderstorms that local residents call monsoon season, have been delayed by the same blocking high-pressure system that was generating the heat dome. The ridge that was trapping heat over the southwest was also blocking the moisture transport that fuels the monsoon. The moisture that would normally be flowing north into Arizona was being deflected by the blocking ridge, keeping the desert in the dry, cloudless, sun-baked conditions that maximised surface heating and prevented the cloud cover that would otherwise moderate the afternoon temperatures. The delayed monsoon was not unusual in itself. The monsoon timing varies from year to year, but the combination of a delayed monsoon with a heat dome of unprecedented intensity in the pre-monsoon period was producing conditions that the historical record had no analogue for. The soil moisture deficit across the Sonoran Desert at the time the heat dome established was already at the extreme end of the historical range, the result of a winter and spring precipitation season that had been substantially below average. Dry soil amplifies heat dome conditions in a mechanism that atmospheric scientists call the soil moisture feedback. When the soil is moist, some of the solar energy reaching the surface is used to evaporate water rather than to heat the surface directly. This evaporation provides a natural cooling effect that moderates surface temperatures. When the soil is dry, there is no water to evaporate, and all of the solar energy goes directly into heating the surface. The dry surface heats more intensely. The hot surface heats the air above it more intensely. The hot air inhibits the convection that might otherwise produce afternoon clouds and thunderstorms that would provide shade and evaporative cooling. The heat dome intensifies. The soil dries further as any residual moisture evaporates. The feedback loop tightens. Understanding this feedback mechanism is essential for understanding why the heat dome over the southwest was producing temperatures that exceeded what the atmospheric pattern alone would have generated. The soil moisture deficit was amplifying the heat dome the way a dry forest amplifies a wildfire. The wildfire risk across the southwest during the heat dome was extreme, and the combination of extreme heat, severe drought, and the strong and erratic winds that can accompany the periphery of large blocking high-pressure systems created fire weather conditions that were being tracked with particular concern by fire managers across the region. The vegetation of the Sonoran Desert and the adjacent upland ecosystems of southern Arizona and New Mexico was at or near its lowest moisture content in the instrumental record, the result of the same winter and spring precipitation deficit that had produced the soil moisture deficit amplifying the heat dome. Dry vegetation burns faster, at higher intensity, and with less ability to be controlled by firefighting resources than vegetation at normal moisture content. The fires that started during the heat dome period, ignited by lightning from the first tentative and distant monsoon thunderstorms that had not yet penetrated to the main heat dome area, or by human activity in the interface between urban development and natural desert, were burning with an intensity that reflected the extreme fire weather environment they were operating in. The Colorado River system, which is the primary source of water for much of the American Southwest, including Phoenix, was entering the heat dome period at storage levels in Lake Mead and Lake Powell that represented the product of more than 2 decades of persistent drought and over-allocation of the river's water resources to the 7 states and 2 countries that draw water from it under the Colorado River Compact. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States by volume when full, was at a storage level that triggered what the Bureau of Reclamation called Tier 2 shortage conditions, which meant mandatory reductions in water deliveries to Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico under the rules established by the Compact. Arizona bore the largest mandatory reductions because of the priority system under which Colorado River water rights are allocated, a first-in-time, first-in-right system that means the most recently appropriated water rights receive reductions first. Arizona's water rights are among the more recently appropriated in the Compact framework, which meant Arizona was absorbing mandatory reductions in deliveries from the Colorado River system at precisely the moment when a historic heat dome was placing unprecedented demands on the water resources available to the state. The groundwater that Arizona uses to supplement its Colorado River allocation was itself under stress that the heat dome was intensifying. The aquifers beneath the Phoenix metropolitan area and the surrounding agricultural regions had been drawn down over decades of intensive use. The rate of groundwater extraction had exceeded the rate of natural recharge in many parts of the system, causing water tables to decline and the cost of pumping to increase as wells had to reach deeper to access the remaining water. The heat dome was increasing the demand on those already stressed aquifers, as outdoor water use for cooling purposes, as irrigation of the landscaping and recreational facilities that define the residential character of the wealthier parts of Phoenix, and as industrial cooling water for the data centers and semiconductor fabrication facilities that had expanded rapidly across the Phoenix metropolitan area in the preceding years, all increased simultaneously with the temperature. The semiconductor fabrication industry that had established a significant presence in the Phoenix area in the early 2020s, attracted by state incentives, available land, and a business environment that welcomed large industrial employers, was one of the more complicated dimensions of the heat dome story. Semiconductor fabrication requires enormous quantities of ultra-pure water for the manufacturing process. A single large fabrication facility can use tens of millions of gallons of water per day. The facilities that had been permitted and constructed in the Phoenix area in recent years had water supply agreements with local utilities and had conducted water availability analyses that demonstrated the availability of sufficient water for their operations under historical and projected future conditions. Those analyses had not incorporated the scenario of a historic drought coinciding with a historic heat dome and triggering mandatory cuts in Colorado River water deliveries. The water supply reality that the fabrication facilities were operating in during the heat dome was more constrained than the reality their water availability analyses had assessed. The tension between the water needs of large industrial water users and the water needs of a residential population in a city experiencing the most extreme heat conditions in its history was becoming visible in ways that it had not been visible in the period of planning and permitting that preceded the facility's construction. The history of Phoenix as a city is, in one important reading, the history of the human effort to make a large urban settlement viable in an environment that the natural climate makes inhospitable for large urban settlements. The city was made viable through a combination of engineering works of extraordinary scale, the dams and canals and aqueducts and pumping stations that bring Colorado River water to the desert, and the cheap energy that powers the air conditioning that makes the desert heat bearable for a population whose physiological adaptations are not those of a desert-evolved species. The engineering works that made Phoenix possible were designed for a climate that no longer exists in the form that defined the design parameters. The climate has changed. The Colorado River flows less water than it did when the compact allocating that water was negotiated. The temperatures are higher than the temperatures that define the planning envelope for the city's water and energy infrastructure. The heat dome building over Phoenix was not just a weather event. It was a stress test of the engineering and institutional systems on which the viability of a 5 million person city in the desert depends. And the stress test was revealing margins that were narrower than the system's designers had assumed. The question of whether Phoenix and Las Vegas and Tucson and the other large cities of the American Southwest that depend on the Colorado River and on cheap energy for air conditioning are sustainable in their current form under the climate conditions now emerging is a question that researchers in urban planning, hydrology, public health, and climate science have been examining with increasing urgency. The question is not whether the cities will disappear. Cities do not disappear quickly, even under severe environmental stress. The question is whether the conditions that have allowed them to grow to their current scale, that have made them attractive destinations for the millions of people who have moved there in the past several decades, seeking affordable housing, economic opportunity, and the particular lifestyle that the Sunbelt cities have offered, can be maintained as the climate continues to change. Whether the water will continue to be available at the cost and in the quantity required to support the current population and the current economy. Whether the electrical grid can continue to be maintained in a condition that prevents catastrophic failure during peak heat demand events of increasing frequency and intensity. Whether the public health infrastructure can be scaled to protect a population experiencing heat conditions that were previously considered extreme outliers, but that are becoming increasingly routine. The atmospheric scientists who were monitoring the heat dome were using language in their technical communications that they do not use for ordinary heat events. The blocking pattern that was maintaining the dome showed no sign of breaking down within the forecast period, which extended 10 to 14 days from the current date. The ridge was anomalously strong by historical standards, stronger than any ridge documented in the instrumental record for this region and time of year, by a margin that the modelling teams were double-checking. The surface temperatures being forecast for the peak of the event exceeded the upper bounds of the ensemble forecast distributions, meaning that the most extreme member of the ensemble of model runs being used to characterise forecast uncertainty was projecting temperatures that were still being reached or exceeded by the actual observations. When the observations exceed the most extreme member of the forecast ensemble, the forecasters are operating outside the range they have tools to characterise with confidence. The attribution science that connects extreme weather events to anthropogenic climate change had advanced dramatically in the years preceding the heat dome, to the point where rapid attribution analyses could be conducted and published within days of a major extreme weather event. The methodology involves running climate models with and without the warming that has resulted from human greenhouse gas emissions, and comparing the probability and intensity of the observed event under those two scenarios. For the Pacific Northwest Heat Dome of 2021, attribution analysis published within 2 weeks of the event concluded that the event was virtually impossible without anthropogenic climate change, that the warming that human emissions had produced had made the event approximately 150 times more likely than it would have been in the pre-industrial climate. The language, virtually impossible without climate change, was careful scientific language that represented a strong consensus statement among the attribution community. For the heat dome now building over the American Southwest, the attribution team was assembling to conduct the same analysis. The preliminary assessment, based on the known relationship between global mean temperature and the probability of extreme heat events, was that the current event was also in the category of events whose probability had been dramatically increased by the warming of the past century and a half. The specific attribution analysis would take weeks to complete with the rigour the scientific community required. The preliminary assessment was sufficient to say that the heat dome was not simply a natural event unconnected to the long-term trajectory of the climate system. It was natural variability operating on top of a background warming that made the most extreme outcomes of that variability more likely and more intense than they would have been in the pre-industrial climate. The feedbacks between the heat dome and the broader climate system were operating simultaneously at multiple scales. At the local scale, the urban heat island effect of Phoenix was amplifying the regional heat dome temperature by several degrees in the most heat-absorbing parts of the city. At the regional scale, the soil moisture deficit across the southwest was amplifying the heat dome through the evaporative feedback mechanism described earlier. At the continental scale, the blocking ridge that was maintaining the heat dome was itself a product of the large-scale atmospheric circulation pattern, which was being modified in ways that atmospheric dynamicists are still working to characterize, by the differential warming of the Arctic relative to the tropics that anthropogenic climate change has been producing. The Arctic has been warming approximately 4 times faster than the global average, a phenomenon called Arctic amplification, and the reduced temperature difference between the Arctic and the tropics has been proposed as a mechanism that weakens the jet stream, makes it more wavy, and makes it more prone to the kind of blocking patterns that produce persistent extreme weather events. The connection between Arctic amplification and blocking frequency is an area of active research, with findings that are not yet fully settled in the scientific literature. But the observational record of increasing blocking frequency and persistence over the past several decades is consistent with what the theoretical arguments about Arctic amplification would predict. The insurance industry was tracking the heat dome with the same intensity it tracks major hurricanes and earthquake events, because the financial exposure from a heat event of this duration and severity in a metropolitan area the size of Phoenix encompasses not just the direct property damage from heat-related failures of infrastructure and equipment, but the enormous indirect costs of business interruption, of increased mortality and morbidity that translates into insurance claims across health, life, and disability policies, of agricultural losses in the surrounding farming regions that depend on the same water supply and weather conditions as the city, and of the longer-term economic effects on property values, migration patterns, and investment decisions in a region that was increasingly being discussed in terms of its long-term climate habitability. The concept of climate habitability has entered the vocabulary of real estate markets, of demographic forecasting, and of municipal planning in ways that would have seemed fringe a decade ago, and that were increasingly mainstream in the context of the heat dome. The question of whether specific regions of the United States will remain habitable, in the sense of being able to support large human populations at reasonable economic cost, without chronic public health emergencies, under the climate conditions projected for the middle and latter parts of the 21st century, is a question that demographers, urban planners, and climate scientists are now engaging with directly. The American Southwest is one of the regions most frequently cited in these discussions, because the combination of heat stress, water scarcity, and wildfire risk in the region is projected to intensify significantly under even moderate warming scenarios, and because the current population and economy of the region are already operating close to the margins of what the natural resource base can support. The people making individual decisions about where to live and work in the United States are beginning to incorporate climate risk considerations into those decisions at a rate that was not evident a decade ago, but that is now showing up in migration data, in real estate pricing differentials, and in the stated preferences of survey respondents asked about their location decisions. The migration patterns of the early 2020s showed some evidence of movement away from the most climate-stressed regions, with outmigration from parts of the Southwest and Florida that was at least partially attributable to climate risk concerns, in addition to the economic and lifestyle factors that have traditionally driven American residential mobility. The heat dome was going to accelerate those conversations, was going to add urgency to the individual and household deliberations about whether the lifestyle and economic advantages of living in Phoenix outweighed the increasing frequency and severity of the heat events that would be a feature of living there for the foreseeable future. The communities that cannot participate in those deliberations are the communities most at risk during the heat dome. The deliberation about whether to stay or to leave a heat-stressed city requires resources. It requires the financial capacity to relocate, to absorb the costs of establishing a new residence in a new location, to accept the disruption to employment and social networks and family relationships that moving entails. It requires the legal status that makes relocation an available option. It requires the information and the cognitive bandwidth to engage with long-term climate risk assessments in the context of the immediate pressures of daily economic survival. These requirements filter the population of people who can participate in climate migration in ways that systematically exclude the populations most physically vulnerable to the heat dome. The people who can leave are often the people least at risk of dying from the heat, because they have better housing, better access to cooling, better health insurance, and more resources to manage heat exposure. The people who cannot leave are often the people most at risk, because their housing is older and less well insulated. Their access to cooling is more precarious, their health is more vulnerable, and their economic circumstances leave them fewer options for adapting to conditions that their bodies and their infrastructure are not equipped to handle. The cooling centres that Phoenix and other southwestern cities operate during extreme heat events are one of the most visible public health interventions available in the immediate term, and their adequacy is a metric that public health researchers use to assess the city's preparedness for extreme heat. A cooling centre is any publicly accessible air-conditioned space where people without access to cooling can seek refuge during extreme heat. Libraries, community centres, shopping malls, churches, and purpose-built cooling facilities can all function as cooling centres. The effectiveness of cooling centres as a life-saving intervention depends on several factors: their geographic distribution relative to the populations most in need of them, their hours of operation relative to the times when heat stress is most dangerous, which includes overnight hours when the lack of nocturnal cooling prevents physiological recovery, their accessibility to people without transportation, particularly elderly individuals and people experiencing homelessness, their capacity relative to the number of people who need them during a major heat event, and the effectiveness of outreach efforts that inform the most vulnerable populations about where the centres are and how to access them. The cooling centre network in Phoenix during the heat dome was larger than it had been in previous heat events, reflecting the investments the city had made in heat preparedness following earlier events that had exposed gaps in the system. it was not large enough. The number of people who needed cooling centre access during the peak days of the event exceeded the capacity of the available facilities in several parts of the city. The geographic distribution of the centres, which reflected the distribution of public facilities like libraries and community centres, did not perfectly match the geographic distribution of heat vulnerability, which was concentrated in older neighbourhoods with less public facility infrastructure. And the overnight operation of cooling centres, which is essential for preventing the cumulative physiological degradation that results from multiple nights of inadequate sleep in hot conditions, remained inconsistent across the network, with some facilities open overnight and others closing in the evening hours when the heat, while somewhat reduced from afternoon peaks, was still dangerous for vulnerable individuals. The public health workers and emergency management officials who were managing the city's heat response during the dome were operating under conditions that tested the limits of the systems they were responsible for in ways that the systems had not previously been tested. The heat mortality surveillance system that tracked heat-related illness and death in real time was producing numbers that exceeded previous records on multiple consecutive days. The emergency medical services were responding to heat-related calls at rates that strained their capacity during the peak afternoon hours. The hospital emergency departments in the most heat-affected parts of the city were managing heat stroke and severe heat exhaustion cases at volumes that required the activation of surge capacity protocols. The medical management of heat stroke, which requires aggressive rapid cooling to reduce core body temperature before permanent neurological damage occurs, is resource-intensive and time-sensitive in ways that make the management of large numbers of simultaneous cases particularly challenging for emergency departments operating at or near capacity on a normal day. The specific physiology of heat stroke is worth understanding in detail because it is the mechanism by which the heat dome converts atmospheric temperature into human mortality, and because understanding the mechanism clarifies why the warning signs are often missed until the condition has progressed to a point where survival is no longer certain. Heat stroke is defined clinically as a core body temperature above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by central nervous system dysfunction. The central nervous system dysfunction is the critical feature that distinguishes heat stroke from the less severe forms of heat illness. It manifests as confusion, disorientation, slurred speech, loss of coordination, seizures, or loss of consciousness. These neurological symptoms occur because the brain is exquisitely sensitive to elevated temperature. Above 40 degrees core temperature, enzymatic processes in brain cells begin to fail. Cell membranes begin to lose their integrity. The cascade of cellular damage that follows is rapid, and in some cases irreversible, which is why the time from recognition of heat stroke to initiation of aggressive cooling treatment is one of the most important determinants of survival and neurological outcome. The problem with heat stroke as a public health emergency is that the early stages of the progression from heat exhaustion to heat stroke can be difficult for both the affected individual and observers to recognize. The person experiencing the progression may feel increasingly confused and disoriented in a way that they interpret as normal fatigue from the heat, rather than as a medical emergency. They may not recognize that their judgment and perception are impaired. They may not seek help or respond appropriately to attempts by others to help them. Observers may interpret the behavioral changes as intoxication, as mental illness, or as ordinary heat-related fatigue, without recognizing the neurological impairment that indicates the transition from a serious condition to a life-threatening one. By the time the affected individual is found unresponsive or in a state that clearly requires emergency medical intervention, the window for optimal treatment may have already narrowed. The cooling protocols used in hospital emergency departments for heat stroke have evolved significantly in the past 2 decades, driven by military medicine research on exertional heat stroke in soldiers and by emergency medicine research on classic heat stroke in elderly patients during heat waves. The current best practice involves cold water immersion, submerging the patient in a cold water bath maintained at a temperature between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, which is the most effective method for rapidly reducing core body temperature. The rate of cooling achievable with cold water immersion, when applied promptly, is sufficient to reduce core temperature to the target range before irreversible neurological damage occurs in the majority of patients who arrive at the hospital while still alive and before the condition has produced multi-organ failure. The limitation of this approach is that it requires equipment, space, and staffing that is not uniformly available in all emergency care settings, and that the time from symptom onset to hospital arrival in many heat stroke cases is longer than the window within which the most aggressive cooling can prevent serious harm. The pre-hospital cooling that is initiated by emergency medical services before hospital arrival is increasingly recognised as an important determinant of heat stroke outcome, and the protocols used by emergency medical technicians and paramedics for field treatment of suspected heat stroke have been updated in many jurisdictions to reflect this understanding. Evaporative cooling, the application of water to the patient's skin combined with fanning to maximise evaporation, is the most practical pre-hospital cooling method and can achieve meaningful rates of temperature reduction when applied promptly. But the effectiveness of pre-hospital cooling depends on the ambient conditions. In the environment of a 127-degree day in Phoenix, the evaporative cooling that works well in milder conditions is less effective because the ambient temperature is so high that the thermal gradient between the patient and the environment is reduced. The physics of heat transfer work against rapid cooling in an environment where the ambient temperature approaches or exceeds the patient's skin temperature. Getting the patient into an air-conditioned ambulance is itself a meaningful cooling intervention in these conditions, but the demand on emergency medical services during the peak of the heat dome meant that ambulance response times in some parts of the city were extended beyond normal, reducing the time available for pre-hospital treatment before hospital arrival. The emergency department physicians and nurses managing heat stroke patients during the heat dome were doing so in the context of an overall patient volume that exceeded normal capacity, not just because of heat stroke cases, but because the heat was exacerbating a wide range of underlying conditions across the patient population. Cardiovascular disease is the condition most dramatically worsened by heat. The cardiovascular system is under extreme stress during exposure to high ambient temperatures because the body increases cardiac output to drive more blood to the skin surface for cooling. For a person with a healthy cardiovascular system, this increased demand is manageable. For a person with coronary artery disease, heart failure, or hypertension, the increased cardiac demand can precipitate acute cardiac events. The incidence of acute myocardial infarction, of heart failure decompensation, of cardiac arrhythmias all increase during extreme heat events in ways that are reflected in the emergency department visit data and in the excess mortality statistics. The physicians treating these conditions during the heat dome were doing so in an environment where the heat that caused or contributed to the condition continued to stress the patient's cardiovascular system even after hospital admission, because the hospital's air conditioning system, under the same grid pressure that was affecting residential systems across the city, was maintaining interior temperatures that were lower than the outdoor extreme, but that were not always achieving the optimal cooling environment for critically ill cardiac patients. The renal system is another organ system with particular heat vulnerability that was generating a specific pattern of emergency department presentations during the heat dome. Heat-related acute kidney injury occurs through a combination of mechanisms. Dehydration reduces renal blood flow and decreases the kidney's ability to filter waste products from the blood. Rhabdomyolysis, the breakdown of muscle tissue that can occur during severe heat stress or exertional heat illness, releases myoglobin into the bloodstream that is toxic to the kidneys at high concentrations. And in some patients, particularly those taking medications that affect renal blood flow or that require adequate kidney function for safe metabolism, the combined stress of dehydration and the pharmacological effects of their medications during heat conditions produces an acute kidney injury that requires aggressive intravenous fluid resuscitation and, in the most severe cases, dialysis. The dialysis units of Phoenix hospitals were managing patients with heat-related acute kidney injury alongside their normal chronic dialysis population, the patients with end-stage renal disease who require regular dialysis to survive and who themselves represent a highly heat-vulnerable population because of the multiple medical conditions that typically accompany chronic kidney failure. The pharmaceutical dimension of heat vulnerability is one that primary care physicians and emergency medicine specialists have become increasingly focused on as extreme heat events have become more frequent. A significant number of medications commonly used to treat chronic conditions affect the body's ability to thermoregulate or increase susceptibility to heat illness in ways that the prescribing physicians and the patients taking the medications may not fully appreciate. Diuretics, which are widely used to treat hypertension and heart failure, increase urine output and can accelerate dehydration during heat stress. Anticholinergic medications, including some antihistamines, bladder medications, and psychiatric medications, impair sweating, reducing the body's primary heat dissipation mechanism. Beta blockers, used for heart conditions and anxiety, reduce the heart rate response to heat stress, limiting the cardiovascular system's ability to increase blood flow to the skin for cooling. Antipsychotic medications affect temperature regulation through central nervous system mechanisms that are not fully understood, but that clearly increase the risk of heat-related illness in patients taking them. The combination of multiple medications, common in elderly patients with multiple chronic conditions, can produce additive effects on heat vulnerability that are greater than any individual medication's effect alone. The primary care practices and specialist offices across Phoenix were receiving calls from patients during the heat dome, asking whether their medications needed to be adjusted for the heat, whether they should be reducing their diuretic dose to avoid dehydration, whether they needed to increase their fluid intake to compensate for the additional sweating the heat was producing. The guidance available to physicians answering these questions was less specific than the urgency of the situation demanded, partly because the evidence base for medication management during extreme heat events in the community setting is thinner than the clinical importance of the question would suggest. The research on heat-related illness has historically focused on the acute presentation in the emergency department rather than on the preventive modifications that could be made in the outpatient setting to reduce the incidence of that presentation. The heat dome was generating a real-world clinical demand for the kind of evidence-based guidance that the research base had not fully developed. The mental health dimension of the heat dome was receiving less attention than the physical health dimension in the real-time public health response, but was no less significant for the populations experiencing it. Research conducted in the years preceding the heat dome had established a robust epidemiological association between high ambient temperatures and increased rates of psychiatric emergency visits, of violent behaviour, of suicide attempts, and of suicide completions. The mechanisms behind these associations are multiple. Heat directly affects brain function in ways that impair judgment, increase impulsivity, and reduce the cognitive resources available for emotional regulation. Sleep disruption from overnight heat stress compounds these effects, because sleep deprivation itself impairs the prefrontal cortical function that is central to emotional regulation and impulse control. The combination of direct neurological effects of heat and sleep deprivation produces a state of increased psychological vulnerability that interacts with pre-existing mental health conditions, with substance use, with social isolation, and with the economic stress that the heat dome was intensifying through increased utility bills and disrupted work schedules for outdoor workers. The mental health emergency systems in Phoenix were tracking the heat dome through the lens of psychiatric emergency volumes, of crisis line call rates, of emergency department mental health presentations, and of the reports from community mental health workers doing outreach in the neighborhoods most affected by the heat. What they were documenting was consistent with the research literature on heat and mental health. The temperatures were elevated, the mental health emergency metrics were elevated, and the relationship between the two was appearing in the real-time data in a pattern that matched what the epidemiological studies had found in historical data. The challenge of responding to an elevated mental health emergency burden during a heat dome is that the response requires the same human and physical resources that the physical health emergency is also straining, that the community mental health workers doing outreach in hot neighborhoods are themselves subject to heat stress that limits their working hours and their effectiveness, and that the psychiatric inpatient facilities that provide the most intensive level of care for psychiatric emergencies are themselves operating in an environment where their climate control systems are under the same grid pressure as every other air-conditioned facility in the city. The data center and technology infrastructure that Phoenix had been positioning as a pillar of its economic development strategy in the years preceding the heat dome represented a specific category of heat vulnerability that the city's economic planners had not fully integrated into their climate risk assessments. Data centers require large amounts of electricity for computing operations and large amounts of cooling to prevent the heat generated by those computing operations from damaging the servers and other electronic equipment. The cooling loads of data centers increase with ambient temperature because the heat exchangers and cooling towers that reject waste heat from the data center to the atmosphere become less efficient as the ambient temperature approaches the temperature of the cooling fluid inside the system. During the heat dome, the cooling efficiency of data center facilities across the Phoenix metropolitan area decreased, requiring increased electricity consumption for cooling to maintain the equipment temperatures within operating specifications. This increased electricity demand from data centers came on top of the increased electricity demand from residential and commercial cooling, contributing to the overall peak demand that was stressing the electrical grid. The semiconductor fabrication facilities that had been celebrated as a major economic development success for Phoenix and Arizona were operating under similar constraints. Semiconductor fabrication processes are exquisitely sensitive to temperature and humidity conditions. The clean rooms where wafers are processed require extremely precise environmental control, with temperature maintained within fractions of a degree and humidity maintained within narrow bands. Maintaining those conditions during the heat dome required the facility's environmental control systems to work at maximum capacity, consuming electricity at rates that exceeded normal operations. The water consumption for semiconductor fabrication, which does not decrease with ambient temperature the way that some industrial water uses do, was continuing at normal rates at precisely the moment when the broader water supply stress was most acute. The tension between the operational requirements of these facilities and the broader resource constraints of the heat dome event was being managed through a combination of technical measures within the facilities and utility coordination at the grid level, but the margin was narrow enough that facility engineers were monitoring the situation continuously. The agricultural sector of the Arizona economy, which operates in the desert environment of the state using the same water supplies that the urban population depends on, was experiencing the heat dome as a direct production crisis rather than as an indirect infrastructure stress. The vegetable and cotton and alfalfa crops that are grown in the irrigated agricultural regions of the Salt River Valley and the other river systems that supply Arizona agriculture were experiencing heat stress that reduced yields, accelerated maturation in ways that complicated harvest timing, and in some crops, produced quality degradation that reduced market value, even for crops that survived the heat. The workers who harvest these crops were working in conditions that exceeded occupational heat exposure guidelines in the absence of robust regulatory enforcement of those guidelines, and the pattern of heat illness among agricultural workers during the heat dome was consistent with what public health researchers studying agricultural labour heat exposure had predicted would occur under conditions of this severity. The economic losses in the agricultural sector during the heat dome were being tracked by the Arizona Department of Agriculture and by the agricultural lenders and insurance companies that had financial exposure to the affected operations. Crop insurance claims were being filed at rates that reflected the severity of the yield losses, and the actuarial data being generated by the event was going to be incorporated into future premium calculations and coverage availability decisions in ways that would affect the cost and availability of agricultural insurance in heat-stressed regions for years to come. The same dynamic that was playing out in the residential property insurance market, where the increasing frequency and severity of climate-related losses was driving premium increases and coverage withdrawals that reduced the financial resilience of the populations most exposed to those losses, was playing out in agricultural insurance in a manner that had direct implications for the viability of farming operations that were already operating on thin margins in a resource-constrained environment. The water temperature of the Salt River and the other waterways in the Phoenix region was itself reaching levels during the heat dome that were generating ecological concerns from fisheries managers and environmental scientists monitoring the aquatic ecosystems. Cold water fish species that occupy some stretches of these waterways require water temperatures below specific thermal thresholds to survive. When water temperatures exceed those thresholds for extended periods, the fish experience physiological stress that leads to mortality. The extreme air temperatures of the heat dome were raising water temperatures in some stretches of the river system to levels that the cold water species could not tolerate, producing fish kills that were being documented by wildlife managers and that represented losses to aquatic biodiversity that would take years to recover even after the heat dome event ended. The nighttime temperature record was being broken on multiple consecutive nights during the heat dome in ways that were scientifically significant for reasons beyond the immediate discomfort and health impact they produced. The overnight low temperature in Phoenix on a typical summer night had historically dropped to the low 90s Fahrenheit, or occasionally below 90, providing a period of reduced thermal stress that allowed both the urban environment and its human inhabitants to partially reset before the next day's heating cycle. During the heat dome, the overnight lows were remaining above 100 degrees Fahrenheit on consecutive nights, a pattern that had no precedent in the Phoenix instrumental record. The persistence of temperatures above 100 degrees through the night reflected the extreme depth and intensity of the heat dome, which was maintaining temperatures high enough that even the nighttime radiative cooling that normally brings surface temperatures down was insufficient to overcome the heat trapped in the lower atmosphere by the blocking ridge above. The consequences of multiple consecutive nights above 100 degrees were accumulating in the urban fabric of Phoenix, in ways that were making each successive day more dangerous than the last. The concrete and asphalt of the urban landscape store heat during the day and release it overnight. On a normal summer night, the stored heat is largely dissipated by morning, and the surface begins the next day's heating cycle from a base temperature that, while warm, is within the historical range of urban surface temperatures. After multiple consecutive nights above 100 degrees, with insufficient overnight cooling to dissipate the accumulated heat from the days preceding, the surfaces of the urban landscape were beginning each new day at temperatures that were already elevated above the normal morning baseline. Each day's heating cycle was starting from a hotter foundation, amplifying the peak temperatures reached in the afternoon. The progression was not linear. Each day that the overnight low failed to drop below a threshold sufficient for meaningful surface cooling was a day that made the following afternoon incrementally more extreme, and the cumulative effect of a week of insufficient overnight cooling was creating conditions that were significantly more severe than a week of equivalent daytime temperatures with adequate overnight recovery would have produced. The atmospheric scientists watching the heat dome from their monitoring stations and their modelling systems were tracking this surface energy storage amplification in real time, using land surface temperature data from satellite imagery to document the progressive elevation of urban surface temperatures across the Phoenix metropolitan area over the course of the event. The satellite data, which provides surface skin temperatures at spatial resolutions that allow the urban heat island pattern to be mapped in detail, was showing surface temperatures in the most heat-absorbing parts of the city that exceeded air temperature measurements by more than 20 degrees Fahrenheit on the hottest days of the event. A parking lot in full afternoon sun was reaching surface temperatures of 150 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, temperatures at which the asphalt itself begins to soften and at which contact with the surface causes immediate thermal burns to exposed skin. The documentation of these surface temperatures was important, not just for understanding the immediate heat event, but for characterizing the amplification of the regional heat dome by the urban heat island in a way that would inform future modelling of heat events in cities with similar characteristics. The birds and wildlife that inhabit the urban environment of Phoenix were responding to the heat dome in ways that wildlife researchers and urban ecologists were documenting as an unprecedented natural experiment in the limits of urban wildlife thermal tolerance. Urban wildlife species, the coyotes and javelinas, and various bird species that have adapted to the human-modified landscape of a large desert city, generally have higher thermal tolerance than their wild counterparts because of the generations of selection pressure associated with living in the urban heat island environment. But the temperatures being produced by the heat dome, particularly when combined with the lack of overnight cooling, were pushing even these heat-adapted urban wildlife populations toward their thermal limits. Reports of birds and mammals seeking water and shade in unusual locations, of animals that would normally avoid human contact approaching people in apparent distress, of wildlife found dead in locations suggesting they had been unable to find adequate shade or water, were accumulating in the databases of wildlife monitoring organisations during the event. The urban tree canopy is one of the most important mitigators of urban heat island effects, and one of the most unevenly distributed resources in the Phoenix metropolitan landscape. Neighbourhoods with mature tree cover, which are typically the older, established neighbourhoods, and the wealthier, newer neighbourhoods where landscaping investment is high, experience afternoon temperatures that can be several degrees lower than identical neighbourhoods without tree cover. The shade provided by trees reduces the solar radiation reaching the surface, reducing surface heating. The transpiration of water through tree leaves provides evaporative cooling that reduces both surface and air temperatures. The combination of shading and evaporative cooling from a mature urban tree canopy can reduce local air temperatures by 3 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit relative to an unshaded urban area under otherwise identical conditions. 3 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit is the difference between a temperature that is dangerous and a temperature that is potentially survivable for vulnerable individuals in many heat scenarios. The distribution of tree canopy in Phoenix mirrors the distribution of income and historical investment patterns in ways that are well documented by urban ecologists who have mapped the canopy coverage using aerial and satellite imagery. The wealthier northern suburbs have substantial mature tree cover, the product of decades of landscaping investment by homeowners and municipalities, with the resources to plant and maintain trees in a desert environment that requires irrigation. The older central city neighbourhoods, many of which were developed before the era of intensive residential landscaping, and many of which have experienced disinvestment that has limited the maintenance of existing trees, have sparse canopy coverage. The neighbourhoods with the greatest heat vulnerability are often the neighbourhoods with the least tree canopy, a spatial correspondence that drives a feedback between economic disadvantage and heat exposure that the urban heat island literature calls the double exposure problem. Efforts to address this inequity through urban tree planting programs have been underway in Phoenix and other southwestern cities for years, with varying levels of funding, political support, and community engagement. The challenge of planting trees in a desert city that requires irrigation to sustain them is not trivial. The water required to establish and maintain trees in the Phoenix climate is a significant constraint given the water scarcity that the Colorado River shortage conditions are producing. Trees that are planted without adequate irrigation establishment support have high mortality rates during their first years in the desert environment, and programs that plant trees without providing multi-year irrigation support have sometimes produced outcomes where the investment in planting was largely wasted because the trees did not survive their establishment period. The most successful urban tree programs in desert cities have combined planting with irrigation infrastructure investment and community engagement that builds local support for the maintenance of newly planted trees in the years after planting. The green infrastructure concept that has been gaining traction in urban planning circles as a response to urban heat island effects encompasses a broader set of interventions than tree planting alone. Cool roofs, roofing materials with high solar reflectivity that reduce the amount of solar radiation absorbed by buildings, can reduce rooftop surface temperatures by 20 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit relative to conventional dark roofing materials, and reduce the cooling energy demand of the buildings below them. Permeable pavement surfaces that allow water to infiltrate rather than running off can maintain soil moisture that supports evaporative cooling. Green roofs, thin layers of soil and drought-tolerant vegetation installed on rooftops, provide both shading of the roof surface and evaporative cooling from the vegetation. The deployment of these technologies in Phoenix have been increasing in the years preceding the heat dome, driven by building code updates, utility incentive programs, and the growing recognition among developers and building owners that the long-term energy cost savings from reducing cooling loads justified the additional upfront investment. The scale of deployment relative to the scale of the need remained a significant gap. A few hundred cool roof retrofits in a city of several 100,000 buildings represents a negligible fraction of the urban surface area. The aggregate effect of the cool roofs and permeable pavements and green roofs installed in Phoenix by the time of the heat dome on the overall urban surface energy balance of the metropolitan area was measurable but small, insufficient to meaningfully modify the urban heat island effect during an extreme event. The interventions were going in the right direction. The pace was insufficient for the trajectory of the heat threat being produced by the combination of urban growth and climate change. The electrical vehicles that had been proliferating across the Phoenix metropolitan area in the years preceding the heat dome represented a specific intersection of climate solution and climate problem that was being discussed with new urgency during the event. Electric vehicles are zero direct emission vehicles, and their widespread adoption contributes to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions that is necessary to slow the long-term trajectory of climate change. But electric vehicles are also energy storage devices that require charging, and the aggregate charging demand of a large fleet of electric vehicles adds to the electrical grid load that is already under extreme stress during a heat dome event. The charging patterns of electric vehicle owners, if not managed through smart charging systems that distribute the charging load across off-peak hours, can create demand spikes that occur precisely when the grid is most stressed. The vehicle-to-grid technology that would allow electric vehicle batteries to discharge power back to the grid during peak demand periods, providing a distributed storage resource that could help manage the peak demand stress of a heat dome, was available in some vehicles and was being piloted by utilities in various programs, but was not yet deployed at a scale that could meaningfully affect the grid stress during the event. The broader energy system transition that was underway across the American Southwest during the years surrounding the heat dome event was both a response to climate change and a partial adaptation to the heat stress that climate change was producing. The rapid expansion of solar power generation capacity in the region, driven by the exceptional solar resource of the desert Southwest and by the dramatic cost reductions in photovoltaic technology, was providing a growing share of the electricity consumed by the region during daylight hours. Solar generation in the Southwest tends to peak in the afternoon hours, when the sun is highest and the irradiance is greatest, which is also when the cooling demand is greatest during heat events. This temporal alignment between solar generation and cooling demand is one of the most valuable characteristics of solar power in a heat-stressed desert environment. The problem is that the peak cooling demand extends into the evening hours after the sun has set and solar generation has declined, when the stored heat of the day continues to drive cooling systems and when the grid must rely on other generation sources to meet the demand. Battery storage technology that could store the solar generation of the afternoon for dispatch during the evening peak was being deployed across the Southwest in utility-scale installations and at the residential level, but the scale of deployment remained far below what would be needed to fully bridge the gap between afternoon solar generation and evening cooling demand during a major heat dome event. The heat dome was stress testing the energy transition that the Southwest was in the middle of, revealing the gaps between where the system was and where it needed to be to provide reliable power to a heat-stressed population through the full duration of an extreme event. Those gaps were not unexpected to the energy planners who had been modelling the transition. They were larger than the public communication about the energy transition had typically conveyed, and the heat dome was making their consequences visible in a way that was more politically and personally legible than any planning document or academic analysis had been. The international dimension of the heat dome story was being tracked by atmospheric scientists and public health researchers around the world, because the mechanisms producing extreme heat over the American Southwest were connected to the same large-scale atmospheric dynamics that were producing simultaneous heat events in other parts of the world. The summer of the heat dome was a summer in which multiple regions of the Northern Hemisphere were experiencing concurrent heat extremes that were, when examined individually, each attributable to regional atmospheric conditions, but that, when examined collectively, reflected the signature of a background warming that was making the probability of simultaneous multi-regional heat extremes dramatically higher than it would have been in the pre-industrial climate. Research published in the years preceding the heat dome had documented the increasing frequency of what climate scientists called concurrent heat extremes, heat events occurring simultaneously in multiple regions that would previously have been considered statistically independent. The physical mechanism behind the increasing concurrence involves changes in the large-scale atmospheric circulation that increase the tendency for multiple blocking ridge systems to develop simultaneously in different parts of the Northern Hemisphere, each producing heat dome conditions in its own region, each individually understandable as a regional atmospheric event, collectively representing a pattern of atmospheric behaviour that is departing from the historical norms that the instrumental record documents. The global food system implications of concurrent heat extremes were being discussed in the agricultural economics and food security literature with increasing urgency. When a heat dome reduces crop yields in the American Southwest simultaneously with a heat event reducing yields in Europe and another in South Asia, the aggregate effect on global agricultural production and global food prices is larger than the sum of the individual regional impacts would suggest, because the global food trade system that normally allows regions with crop failures to import from regions with surpluses is itself stressed when multiple major producing regions are experiencing simultaneous failures. The price signals that propagate through global agricultural commodity markets from concurrent regional crop failures can translate into food price increases that affect the most food-insecure populations around the world. Populations that are not in Phoenix or in any other American city, but that are nonetheless connected to the heat dome through the global systems of food trade and commodity pricing that link agricultural production and consumption across national boundaries. The water that evaporated from Lake Mead and Lake Powell during the heat dome, the water lost to evaporation from the surface of these enormous reservoirs that are already at critically low levels, was adding an incremental but measurable stress to a water supply system that was already operating close to its limits. Evaporation from reservoir surfaces is driven by the temperature difference between the water surface and the overlying air, by the wind speed over the reservoir, and by the vapor pressure deficit of the overlying air, which is a measure of how much additional water vapor the air can absorb. During a heat dome, all three of these drivers are elevated simultaneously. The air temperature is high, the vapor pressure deficit is large because the hot, dry air of the desert heat dome can absorb enormous quantities of water vapor. The wind patterns associated with the blocking ridge can produce persistent surface winds that enhance evaporative mixing. The result is evaporation rates from the reservoir surfaces that are significantly elevated above normal summer values, removing water from the storage system that is needed to meet human water demands and that cannot be replaced by precipitation because the heat dome is also suppressing the precipitation that would normally provide some summer recharge to the system. The hydrological cycle acceleration that global warming is producing, the tendency for warmer temperatures to increase the rate of evaporation from both land and water surfaces, and to increase the amount of water vapor that the atmosphere can hold before precipitation occurs, is intensifying the variability of the water cycle in ways that are making wet periods wetter and dry periods drier in many regions. The American Southwest is in the dry category of this intensification. The region is experiencing what climate scientists call aridification, a long-term trend toward drier conditions that is being driven by the combination of reduced precipitation and increased evaporative demand associated with warming. The heat dome was an acute expression of this aridification trend, an extreme event that was nonetheless consistent with the direction in which the regional climate was moving, and that provided a preview of conditions that climate projections suggest will become increasingly common as global temperatures continue to rise. The projections for future heat in the American Southwest under continued greenhouse gas emissions scenarios are among the most dramatic in the global climate change literature. Mid-century projections for Phoenix under high emission scenarios suggest that the number of days per year exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit could increase from the current historical average of approximately 18 days to more than 100 days. More than 100 days per year above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. 110 degrees Fahrenheit is the threshold at which outdoor work becomes dangerous for healthy adults after relatively brief exposure. More than 100 days per year at or above that threshold would transform the economic geography of Phoenix in ways that would fundamentally alter the viability of the outdoor labour-dependent sectors of the economy, would transform the public health requirements of the city in ways that would require infrastructure investments of enormous scale, and would transform the daily lived experience of the city's residents in ways that are difficult to fully imagine from the current baseline, but that the heat dome was providing a partial preview of. The human beings living through the heat dome in Phoenix in the summer of the year the temperatures broke records that had seemed permanent were not living through a statistical abstraction or a modelling scenario. They were living through a physical reality that manifested as the specific texture of stepping outside into air that hit them like the exhaust from a massive engine, as the particular discomfort of sleeping in a room that remained above 90 degrees despite the air conditioning running continuously, as the economic calculation of whether the electricity bill generated by that continuously running air conditioning was going to be manageable at the end of the month, as the worry about the elderly neighbour who had not been seen in 2 days and who lived alone without reliable air conditioning, as the disruption to the outdoor workers who could not do their jobs safely during the hottest hours and who were losing income they could not afford to lose. The heat dome was converting the abstract trajectories of climate change into the specific textures of daily life in ways that numbers and projections could not fully convey. It was doing so in a city that had been built on the assumption that the desert environment could be managed through engineering and energy, and the particular American optimism about the capacity of technology to overcome environmental constraints. That assumption was not entirely wrong. Phoenix existed and would continue to exist. Its people were surviving and would continue to survive. But the margins were narrowing. The engineering systems on which survival depended were being stressed in ways that revealed their limits. The social systems on which the most vulnerable residents depended for protection from those limits were being overwhelmed in ways that revealed their inadequacy. And the atmospheric system that was producing the heat dome was responding to forcings that were not going to diminish on any human policy-relevant timescale without dramatic reductions in the greenhouse gas emissions that were driving the background warming that made events like this one more probable and more severe. The meteorologists monitoring the heat dome were watching the blocking ridge for the first signs of breakdown. The jet stream patterns that had maintained the ridge in place for weeks showed the first tentative indications of change in some of the longer-range model runs. But meteorologists who had watched blocking events through the instrumental record knew that the models often suggested imminent breakdown that did not materialize, that the jet stream could maintain a blocking pattern well beyond the range at which the models initially suggested it would break. The forecast for the continuation of the heat dome remained uncertain beyond the 1-week range, and within the 1-week range, the forecast was for temperatures that continued to break records on multiple consecutive days, for overnight lows that continued to fail to provide adequate cooling, and for the electrical and water systems of the Phoenix metropolitan area to continue to operate under stresses that their operators had never been required to manage for this duration. The 127 degrees in the shade that had been recorded on that Wednesday afternoon was not the peak of the event. The atmospheric scientists analysing the trajectory of the blocking ridge and the surface energy balance of the urban landscape were projecting that temperatures would continue to climb toward the peak of the event in the days ahead, that the cumulative heat stored in the urban surface was still building, and that the worst days of the heat dome were still to come. The margin between the current conditions and the conditions that would begin to produce failures in the systems on which the city's survival depended was narrower than it had been at the start of the event. Each day that passed without the blocking ridge breaking down was a day that consumed more of that margin and brought the city closer to the intersection of atmospheric extreme and infrastructure limit that no desert city of 5 million people had ever been required to navigate. The heat dome was still building. The ridge was still holding. The surface of Phoenix was still absorbing the solar radiation of a desert summer sky unimpeded by clouds, still storing the heat of each day in the concrete and asphalt and rooftops and roads of a city that had been built in a desert with the confidence that the desert could be managed, and was now discovering, day by day and degree by degree, the difference between the desert it had been built for and the desert it now inhabited. The air conditioner in the house on the east side of Phoenix has been running for 19 consecutive days. The family inside it has not looked at the electricity bill. They have decided, without discussing it explicitly, that they will look at the bill when the heat breaks. This is a rational decision. It is also the only decision available to them, because the alternative to running the air conditioner is not discomfort. It is something that the human body, at 127 degrees in the shade, with no overnight cooling for 19 days, does not recover from. This is the heat dome reduced to its smallest possible unit. One family, one machine, one calculation that is no longer about comfort or cost, but about survival in a city built on the assumption that survival would never require this kind of accounting. The blocking ridge that has held the dome in place for 19 days will eventually break down. It always does. The jet stream will shift. The moisture will return. The temperatures will fall back toward the range that Phoenix has historically called summer and that the rest of the country calls extreme. The heat dome will end. The records it set will be documented. The excess mortality will be calculated weeks later by epidemiologists, comparing the death rate during the event to the expected death rate based on historical patterns, and the number they produce will be larger, significantly larger, than the official heat death count reported in real time, because that is how heat kills, quietly, in the bodies of people whose death certificates will list cardiac arrest, or respiratory failure, or renal failure, and will not list the 127 degrees in the shade that pushed those systems past the point of recovery. The scientific community will conduct the attribution analysis, and it will conclude, with the careful, probabilistic language that attribution science requires, that the event was made dramatically more probable and significantly more intense by the anthropogenic warming of the past century and a half. That conclusion will be accurate. It will be reported. It will be filed alongside the attribution analyses of the events that preceded it, and will be joined by the attribution analyses of the events that follow it. The archive of documented climate extremes will grow. The Colorado River will continue to carry less water than the compacts that allocated it anticipated. Lake Mead will continue at levels that trigger mandatory shortage conditions. The semiconductor fabrication facilities will continue to consume the water their processes require. The aquifers beneath the Phoenix metropolitan area will continue to decline. The urban heat island will continue to trap the heat that each new building and each new parking lot and each new road surface adds to the system. The population of the Phoenix metropolitan area will continue to grow because people make location decisions based on the conditions they currently experience and the opportunities currently available, not on the projections of what those conditions will be in 20 or 30 years. The projections suggest more days above 110 degrees. The projections suggest more heat domes. The projections suggest that the conditions that required 19 consecutive days of maximum air conditioner operation and unprecedented grid stress and cooling center overflow and heat mortality that will take months to fully count will not be the conditions that define the outer boundary of what Phoenix will experience. They will be the new baseline from which the next extreme event departs. The saguaro cacti on the edge of the city, the ones that have been standing for 100 years and that have survived every summer that came before this one, are still standing. Some of them show the scars of this summer on their south-facing surfaces. The tissue damage that extreme heat produces in a cactus, that evolved for extreme heat, but not for this extreme heat, is visible to the researchers who monitor the population. It is not visible to the people driving past on the highway, who see the iconic silhouettes against the evening sky and experience them as permanent features of a landscape that has always looked this way and that will always look this way. The landscape has always looked this way. It will not always look this way. The cacti that are standing now include individuals that will not survive the next heat dome of this intensity. The individuals that replace them, if the conditions that allow saguaro establishment persist, will be the ones whose genetics place them at the upper end of the thermal tolerance distribution of the species. The Sonoran Desert is, slowly and invisibly, selecting for heat. The people in the house on the east side of Phoenix are not selecting for anything. They are waiting for the bill and waiting for the heat to break and doing the things that people do when they are inside a city that is inside a dome of air that has nowhere to go. They are watching the thermometer, they are checking on the neighbour, they are running the air conditioner. Outside, the temperature is 127 degrees in the shade. The dome is still holding.